God is love. And God wants us to love each other. God has designed this world where humans can live together, and the idea is to live together in humility and love, kindness, thinking about others, not just thinking about ourselves. And that also includes in marriage, and sometimes that's the most difficult place because it's very familiar. Maybe sometimes we take our spouse, or maybe even sometimes our children, our parents for granted. We just think, well, they're always going to be there. They've kind of got their job to do. Of course, their job's to take care of me, love me, make sure all my needs are met, but sometimes it can become very selfish, and that can be a problem. And so this Family Matters things, it kind of stems from last week. I was thinking about starting out by saying, happy Mother's Day. On Mother's Day. But last week was Mother's Day, and we looked at a beautiful story of Hannah and how she trusted in the Lord. And even when it was so difficult in her life, she wasn't really trusting in other people. She wasn't really trusting in her husband. I mean, her husband was trustworthy, but to meet her needs, she trusted in God. And that's so important, because when we start thinking that other people are going to take the place of God, that somehow my spouse is supposed to fill all my desires, all my inward longings, to fill my heart. Like, that's just asking too much of your spouse. I mean, could you imagine if your spouse came to you and said it? That we would never say that, but I want you to treat me like God treats me, right? Well, in the ideal world, it'd be like, yeah, they could do that. But sometimes your spouse might let you down. And anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, just me. I let my spouse down, just things I say or things I don't say or things I do and don't do, so all kinds of things can happen, but we realize that God is the one who's God, and he's the one who's going to fill my heart and feel my longings and that's the story of Hannah. So I didn't want to go through the story of Hannah, but I'll start with the story of Hannah. How does that sound? And if you weren't here last week, you may have no idea why I'm talking about this today, but I thought I'd at least bring it up. Just for fun. It's actually not going to be that fun, but anyway, we'll go through it. So Elkanah had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, and Hannah had no children. So that's kind of where we started. But I didn't really give much of a commentary about Elkanah, right? Because you're kind of reading along and go, oh, hang on. He had two wives? Two. Well, that's kind of interesting, two wives. And it seemed like he was a fairly godly man. So, Old Testament, maybe two wives are okay. And yet, so somehow we're trying to think, well, what's God's plan for people? And that's kind of the scripture that was read a little bit earlier from Mark chapter 10, about God did have a plan. And human beings, quite often, we have a tendency, and maybe we're really good at it, of just messing up God's plan. And we may say, I even know what God's plan is, but either intentionally or maybe sometimes we just go along with the culture. The culture. And for us that are older than 30, I'm just kidding, maybe even a little bit older than 30, but we've seen how culture has changed. Not just in the choices people make or in the lifestyle that they have, but the acceptance of the lifestyle. I mean, even in the church sometimes, we may see somebody that is 70 or 80 years old, and it's kind of like, well, one of their grandchildren is living in a way. Maybe they're just living with their boyfriend or girlfriend, or maybe they're just kind of getting a divorce and remarrying somebody else, or maybe they're even living in a homosexual lifestyle. And maybe if I asked them 40 years ago, they may have only been 30 or 40, but they may have had an opinion, and you would have said, do you think that's okay to do that? Probably. Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about church people maybe in the world, but even in the world, a lot of times that was not accepted. I mean, it was done. I understand that. But it's not like everybody was saying, that's just great. Just go ahead and do it and enjoy it. We're kind of like, nah, there's something about that. It just doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel right. It's just, maybe there's a better way. But now what about in the church now? Sometimes we look around the church and we say, well, like even sometimes we look at Christians and say, well, if they're having an affair, or if they're having premarital sex, or if they are engaged in pornography, or if they involved in other ways, whether it be sexually or other things, but we're talking about marriage. And I think maybe that's the way it happened in the Old Testament sometimes. There's a lot of, I even hate to say this out loud, so I don't, you should probably say I shouldn't have said it, but it's a reality. In the Old Testament, you kind of find out that a lot of guys, we would say are heroes of the faith, either had more than one wife or had a woman that was called a concubine or a servant girl that they were also having children with. You're kind of like, that's weird. That's weird. So, like, I just wrote a couple of them down. I couldn't remember them all. But even back in the days of Genesis, this happened. We got Jacob and Esau both had multiple wives. King David had several wives. Solomon had 700 wives. He went a little bit overboard. Now, I know. Some people say, like, having one is enough, right? All right. Judah, Gideon, Samson. Now, Samson didn't have more than one wife, but he did have several girlfriends, and I'm just trying to figure out my audience here, just make sure there's no real little kids. But, he was also sleeping with prostitutes, okay? So, you're kind of like, wow, these are the people that God was working through, the people that God was using. And so what's the plan, or what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to interpret that? Just a side note that I find kind of strange, even in our country here, although at one time we were people that kind of followed the Bible, and it seems like, as far as I can tell, you can do almost anything sexually that's even very strictly prohibited from the Bible, except the one thing, right? I mean, you can even sleep with prostitutes, or one thing you can't do, though, is polygamy, which is the one thing like everybody did, seems, in the Old Testament, right? So it just seems like, I don't know, why not polygamy? Is it a tax issue, maybe? Or, I mean, I can't figure out why the government would say it's okay. It's like, what do they got to lose, right? But what we're saying is, what does the Bible say? And that's kind of the confusing point, even in Jesus' day. And maybe it was debatable. Some people were thinking, well, what is this idea of God's plan for a man and a woman? We would say a husband and wife, or for a family, or for people to find, this love and this commitment, and maybe even have children, and that type of thing. And so that's the question that came up. So this is from the Bible reading a little bit earlier. The Pharisees came to Jesus. Now, they did come testing him, which means they were not really sincere in the question. They were trying to trap him. Because they're thinking, if we ask him a question, either way he answers, he's going to be wrong in somebody's eyes. Somebody's going to be mad at him. Some of the people are going to be divided now because he said this and I believe that. And, he's crossed the line, or he's on the other side of the fence, or we're just not getting along. So it's kind of like even today, people try to divide people up based on what you think, about our country, or about morals, or about, even politics, things like that. So he's just saying, well, this is the question. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And in another translation, it talks about, or another place, I think it was in Matthew, the question is, for any reason at all. Can you divorce for any reason? Or what is the reason? When should a man divorce his wife? And so the problem back then, some people were divorcing their wife all the time. Wives, they get married, they weren't very happy, and they thought, well, I'm going to divorce my wife, and I'm going to marry somebody else, and I'm not happy again. And we kind of see something like that with the woman at the well in John chapter 4. Although she's the one who had multiple husbands, we don't know if maybe she was a little harder to get along to live with than other women, so the husband's divorced her, or maybe she's divorcing her husbands because she doesn't like them, or she's just not a very good person to select the right guy, or whatever it is, or could have been a black widow, so we could write a story about that. But we don't know, like, what happened. She's got all these men in her life that, and now she's still living with a guy. The man you have now is not your husband. So we see that happening, but, well, what's God's plan? Now, this is the idea. This is God's plan for us because this is the best thing. This is the best way to do it. It's not like God's making all these rules because he wants to make your life miserable. He actually wants to make your life a blessing to other people, and he also wants to be glorified in our life, and even specifically in the commitments we make. So, is it lawful? Is it legal? And they're kind of saying from a Bible perspective, from God's plan, what does this say about divorce? So he says, Jesus reply, and quite often he does answer a question with a question. So he's saying, will you tell me, what does the Bible say? And it's kind of interesting, in the Old Testament, they could have said, well, the Bible does say, do not commit adultery, but they decided that's not the one we want to quote. So let's quote the one on Moses in Deuteronomy 24. That's in the bottom left there. This is what Moses said. He said that a person, a man, is not going to divorce his wife, but he does give a variety, or really, maybe it's one, but even that's sometimes hard to explain or to understand or to interpret. So what did Moses command you? Maybe it would be helpful if I did read this from Deuteronomy chapter 24. It's just the first couple of verses. And even as I read it, just maybe understand that Moses is not saying this is what you all should do. He's saying if this is going to happen, because apparently it was already happening. So people were divorcing a lot. And so he put rules or regulations on the divorcing so that people just don't take it so lightly. So he's saying there's something to this, but this is what Moses said in Deuteronomy chapter 24. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. So just stop right there for a second. So he's displeased with his wife. That's not why he divorces her, because he's displeased with her. Because we could just say, well, I'm just not very happy with my wife today, so I'm going to divorce her. Or, it's not been a good week, so I'm going to divorce her. Or back in the day, they even talked about, well, she burnt the breakfast today, so I'm going to divorce her. But it says because he finds something indecent about her. That's why he's displeased. It's the indecency. And the indecency, it's kind of hard to know, well, like, how do you define that? Burning the breakfast, that's pretty indecent to me. It causes a disgusting smell, and I'm pretty hungry. That's indecent. It's a little deeper than that, right? Indecency. The idea is the word in Hebrew is very similar or used many times or translated many times in the Bible as nakedness. There's something naked. There's something uncovered that, and again, if you're familiar with the idea of nakedness, that, you're not supposed to see somebody naked unless they're your spouse. So, for instance, you remember even Noah, like one of his sons even saw him naked by mistake, but he still saw him, and he was cursed because of it. So it's pretty serious, right? In other words, and so he's not talking about accidentally happening, but maybe it sounds like that is very indecent to the point maybe where it is sexual immorality. Does that make sense? But again, we want to interpret that however we want. So we're going to make this as broad as I want to make it, because I'm just not, happy with my spouse today, so this is my reason. Does that make sense? Do you ever know somebody that sometimes takes a verse and twists it to make it say whatever they want it to say, and you're like, I don't think that's what that's saying. But that's what people do sometimes. So he finds something indecent about her. He writes her a certificate of divorce. He gives it to her and sends her out of the house. And if she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man. And her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce. He gives it to her, sends her from his house. Or if he dies, then her first husband, who divorced her, is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin among the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So there's some strong words in there. So the idea is this would be detestable in God's sight. That word's not used a lot in the Old Testament, detestable. Like this is just repulsive. This is just forbidden in God's sight for this to happen. Now what's he saying? Well, if he divorces that woman and she goes and marries somebody else, and that guy divorces her, that guy dies, he cannot take her back because that's disgusting. So in other words, it's kind of like saying, yeah, she burnt the toast this morning, but if you divorce her and she goes out and marries, you can never get her back. You might think, well, she's not that bad of a woman. I better take this seriously. It's not just something I'm going to do on a whim or just because I'm having a bad day, because she is a pretty good woman, and if she leaves, I can't get her back. So there's pretty strong limits on this whole idea of divorce, but this is what they're referring to. Well, Moses said we can give her a certificate of divorce, and that's good enough. And so that's what they were doing in the first century. Everybody's just, well, I'll give her a certificate of divorce because I'm unhappy with her. But they are kind of really mocking God's plan for marriage. And sometimes even doing something to their wife that would certainly take away her self-esteem, to make her feel unworthy, to make her feel like, well, now I've really got nowhere to go unless I go back to my parents' house. She probably doesn't have a long line of men, ready to marry her right away, and she probably doesn't have a college degree and a good job because she was probably a homemaker. So she's got no source of income. She's got no place to live. So she's kind of destitute, and all she can do is hope maybe that someone would marry her. That's just the way they lived back then. But the religious leaders thought, it's not a big deal if we're not happy. Because, by the way, marriage is, I don't know if I told you that before, it's about my happiness. That's why I got married. Somebody make me happy, to fulfill my needs, right? To serve me. Does that make sense? Well, obviously, if I got married for that, I probably wouldn't have been married since 1988. Can hardly do the math, but 38 years, coming on 38. This is what Jesus said then. It was because of your hearts, they were hard, that Moses wrote you this law. Hard hearts. You didn't really want to know what God's will was. You didn't really want to follow what God's command was. You didn't really want to love people like God told you to love people. You have a hard heart. So he said, I know you're going to do this anyway, so I will permit it. That's the idea. I'm not commanding it, I'm permitting it. I'll permit you to get a divorce under these situations, but not God's plan. Because this is what Jesus says. This is kind of the most important part at this point. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So that's what Jesus said, okay? So he's thinking back to Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. One is just kind of saying God made man, that's human beings in God's image. Chapter 2 talks about that God made man first, and then he created woman out of the man. And when the man saw the woman, he was very excited, very joyful, and feeling like this is my companion. This is the one who I can love. This is the one who I can share life with. And her name was Eve, the mother of the living. And so God told them, go out and multiply, have children, and fill the earth. But so from the very beginning, he made a woman for man. That's God's plan. Now we have people today that change the plan. And they say, well, I don't want to live with just one woman. I want to live with multiple women. In other words, today still there's people that are married, but then they also have an affair. There's people that are married that divorce, and sometimes people have been married many times. It's strange. It doesn't happen very often, but there's people today that marry their animals, literally. And then there's just one more that's kind of strange. It just seems weird. People that have married themselves, like they're going to marry themselves. And literally they come before, a place where they're getting married, and they have a mirror, and they say vows to themselves. Marriage vows, because they're going to marry themselves. Now it's like, okay, if you're that desperate and you cannot find somebody, like that's just really, I know they're saying, oh, it's just all about me, and I'm going to make myself happy, and I don't need anybody else. But it's like, well, you can think that, but to actually have to have a ceremony for it, it's like you got something wrong somewhere else, either in your heart or in your mind. It's just not functioning very well. But they have to have a ceremony to realize that I'm worthy of getting married. Whilst no one else wants to marry me, I'll marry myself, by golly. I'll show them. But what's that saying? People say, well, I want to do it whichever way I want. And I want to find happiness in doing it a way that I think will help me and fulfill my desires. But this says God made them male and female. That's God's plan. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. He's still quoting from Adam and Eve, from the garden. A man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife. The two will become one flesh. They'll be united. See, the thing is, getting married and doing a wedding ceremony and saying the vows is a commitment. And almost always, at least in Christian churches, the vow is, till death do us part. Those are actually things that people say. And it's not a contract that's being made, it's a covenant, which means, I'm taking this on, and it's not just about us two, and especially when people do it in a church or in a Christian situation, it's kind of saying the vows in the presence of God. And so you're kind of entering into his presence and making God a part of your marriage and a part of your vows to say, I'm becoming one with God through Jesus Christ, and now I can become one with someone else in marriage. So we are also making this commitment to the Lord. So they're no longer two, but they're one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So that's God's plan for marriage, to go through the hard times together, because that's the commitment you made. And so getting married is not just, I just have all these lovely feelings about this woman, and she's so attractive, and she makes me feel whole, and when we're together, we just have such a great time, and I'm so happy, right? Was anybody like that before you got married? Okay, just me. That's okay. But after you're married, you realize it's not all fun and games. Sometimes there is things we have to work out. Sometimes there's disagreements. Sometimes there's heartache. Sometimes there's feeling like, do they really care about me? And why aren't they helping? And why, just a lot of questions. And then we kind of see things differently. We got to work that out. And part of that is because we come from a different perspective. And that's kind of goes back to where I was at the beginning. At the beginning, I was saying how when society changes, in the Old Testament, when society changes and people began to integrate a lot more with people of the world, we call them pagans, the idol worshipers, the Philistines. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those, but the Philistines, right? They kind of adopted a lot of their practice, and it became normal. It's just a part of our society. We hardly even question anymore. What's the right way? What's God's will? What's the interpretation? We don't even have a Bible study on it anymore because we just kind of accept the ways of the world. But when we get married, the other problem is that I have my idea of what a family looks like. And you know what my idea of a family, at least back when I was younger, maybe if you watch too much TV, your ideal of a family is what you watch. But generally, it's the family you grew up in. That's the only family I've ever really known, up close and personal. My own family. But it just sounds strange. I know you probably wouldn't even understand it, but actually, Judy grew up in a different family than me when she was a kid. Actually, we weren't even in the same city. She was like from Northern Ontario, and boy, they're all weird up there. I'm just kidding. They're a great group of people. I know probably half her family is going to watch this and go, he said what? Yeah, he said that about us. But the idea is we come from two different perspectives of how husbands and wives relate and how parents relate to children and how we act in society, what things we're going to get involved in and how much emphasis we're going to put on, school education compared to school sports, compared to, school friends. All that's different. And so we got to work out the differences. And that's the challenge in marriages of saying, hey, we got to work a lot of things out. And it's not always going to be easy. But in the wedding vows, the traditional wedding vows especially, I know sometimes people today write their own wedding vows. And the more you think about it, wedding vows are not just about, oh, I love you so much, and every time I think about you, I have a warm feeling, and, I can hardly wait to spend the rest of my life with you because we're soulmates. You don't understand, soulmates. So we're going to stay together because we're soulmates. Well, after just a few days of marriage, you're not thinking any of that anymore. You're thinking, what in the world did I do? Right? No, you're not. It's not that bad. If you're single, marriage is awesome, okay? I don't want people to be single like me, never get married after this lesson. Anyway, it's not that bad. I'm just saying it's challenging, and you don't get married because you always have good feelings, because you're not going to stay married because you always have good feelings. You stay married because you made a commitment, because you said, I'm going to love you till the day I die. And love sometimes is going to be hard, but love's not the feeling. That's not the love I'm talking about. The feeling, I'm talking about loving because I made a commitment, because I'm going to commit to you, and we're going to grow through this. And guess what? By the time you've been through the ups and downs and the challenges and the hardships and going through a lot of sorrow together, even sharing in sometimes even the death of other family members and things like that, and going through the birth of children, just all kinds of things that happen, it brings you together. It makes you more one. The difficulties, when you go through them and out the other side, you realize we're closer than we've ever been. Because it's the hard times that actually bring us together. If people say, well, we've not been through that many hard times, we just ignore them all, and we just have all these warm, fuzzy feelings, you know what that is? That's a shallow kind of love. I'm glad you stayed together, but the deep love is when you go through it all together and you come out stronger in the end. So this is the idea, that we will become one and we will be inseparable, because the fact is, when you separate or when you divorce, it's not going to be easy either. You think, oh, that's going to be the easy answer. It's not. It's going to be complicated. It's going to be hard, because it's like literally ripping two people apart that have become one. So in marriage, if you're two becoming one, then when you separate, you're only left with half. And it's not the answer. So the answer is to work through it. Now, I know there's provision for divorce in the words of Jesus, that if someone is sexually unfaithful, if someone commits adultery in marriage, then that is grounds for divorce. But, a lot of times people just say, oh, I'm getting divorced because we just don't see eye to eye anymore. We just don't get along. But that's not the answer. God's answer is commit to the covenant that you made in the presence and in the sight of God as he looked down upon you the day that you got married. So when they were in the house, again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. And this is what Jesus said. Obviously, they may be asking him questions. Jesus, what are you talking about? What does this mean? Explain a little bit more. Get into some more detail. Jesus answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. So the idea of this separation and then another union, he's saying even that's adultery. Adultery of separating and remarrying but that's what Jesus is saying, and that's something that was so strange to the ears of people, even in the first century, because they lived in a culture where divorce and remarriage was commonplace. People did it, and people didn't think much more about it. And I think Jesus is saying, this commitment you've made is kind of like the commitment that God made with his people. So how many times in the Old Testament does God use that example of the Lord with his people is like a union, a marriage. And while the people were unfaithful to God and they left God, God still loved them. He still cared about them. He never cast them off. He never said, well, I'm going to go find a new people. The people of Israel were God's people all the way through. And I'm sure most of us would have given up on them. But God, because he loved them and because of the covenant he made, if he can do that, because as Christians, we're just called to be like God, which is staying true to the commitments and the covenants that we have made. So he's saying, work it through, work it out, get the help you need. Malachi chapter 2 and verse 14. And Malachi is later on in the prophets. Like, this is well beyond Moses, well beyond the kings, and even most of the prophets near the end. Malachi. The Lord is a witness between you and the wife of your youth, kind of your first wife, your first love, the one you first married. He's not even implying how many wives or affairs or whatever's been going on since then, but you've been faithless to her, this wife of your youth. You've not committed to love her and care for her and look after her. You've not fulfilled your vows to her. Now God's really saying, this is what you've done to me. But you've also done this to other people. You're just unfaithful. Though she's your companion and she's your companion and your wife by covenant. See the word covenant. Covenant is different than a contract, right? Covenant is something I make in the presence of God to the woman I'm marrying. The covenant I'm making has no impact on how she acts, how she treats me, how she responds, the type of person she is, or the type of person she'll become, or what we're going to go through. That's kind of why in the traditional marriage vows, it's, through sickness and health and richer or poorer, no matter what happens, I'm going to love you till the day we die. So it's not based on outcomes. It's based on the covenant. Because a contract, everybody's pretty familiar with a contract, right? So you have a contract with your cell phone company. Your cell phone company is trying to figure out, what's the most I can get out of you for the least amount of work? And what you're thinking is, what's the best plan I can get for the least amount of money? Right? So you're both working on a contract. But as soon as somebody in that contract fails to keep their end of the contract, in a minute, it can be shut off, right? Try not paying your bill for a month or two, right? So that's a contract. If you do your part, I'll do my part. And if you do your part, I'll be happy. If you do your part, then I feel obligated. I feel like it's my responsibility now because you've done something good for me. I should do something good for you. A covenant is saying, regardless, I'm going to do good to you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to care for you. I'm going to give myself, willing to die for you, no matter what. That's the covenant of marriage. And these people were saying, it's not that big of a deal. We'll just get a divorce and we'll get remarried. Or we'll have an affair on the side. And it's kind of like, no, he's saying, be faithful to the wife of your youth. And God's also saying, be faithful to me. You made a covenant with me. So by the way, if you're a Christian, you made a covenant with the Lord. It's just maybe another angle on what it is to be a Christian. To be a Christian is to believe in God, to understand that Jesus came to the world and died on the cross for our sins. So we have some understanding. But then we believe in our hearts that Jesus died and he rose from the dead. We confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord. But then we finalize, kind of like we sign, we say the vows of the covenant when we're baptized. Because when we're baptized, we die with Jesus. We're buried in water. We're raised to live a new life. What's a new life? It's a new covenant. It's a new start. It's a new relationship now I have with God in covenant. God has made the covenant with me because he loves me and sent Jesus to die for me. I respond by making a covenant with God that I'm going to love him and serve him and follow him all the days of my life. I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me, no turning back. I've died with Christ. I want to live with him. And if you're a Christian, you made that covenant. Now, maybe today, if you're not a Christian, you're saying, I want to be in this relationship. I want to commit myself to the Lord because he loves me so much. I want to be in a relationship, kind of like a marriage relationship, where we become one with Christ, right? So what marriage was, to become one. We become one with Christ. He lives in me when I become a Christian. So if we can encourage you today in your Christian walk, if we can pray with you, if we can help you, if today you want to be baptized into Christ, to make that commitment and the covenant to be in the Lord. We're going to sing a song. I heard the voice of Jesus say, let's stand, we'll sing. Let us know how we can be a blessing today.